Welcome, everybody. It's a delight to see you as always. And the festival fast approaches. I think we're a month and 2 days or 4 weeks and 2 days from today. So next month in Ojai, among the innumerable high points of the festival will be the first hearing of a brand new piece commissioned by the Ojai Festival, and as I said, made possible by generous support of Barry Sanders with a gift in honor of Nancy Sanders, and it's great that they're both on the call. The piece is The Echoing of Tenses. The composer is Anthony Cheung. The texts are by a group of Asian American composers about a wide range of memory and experience and displacement. The piece is for tenor, Paul Appleby, a member of AMOC, Miranda Cuckson, the violinist from AMOC, who we had at Ojai last year already, and Anthony Cheung himself will be the pianist for this premiere performance. And that takes place on Friday afternoon at 5 p.m. Of the festival with, as I said, Paul, Anthony, and Miranda. I'm delighted that tonight we're joined by the composer and pianist Anthony Cheung, the violinist Miranda Cuckson, Matthew Aucoin, one of the co-founders of AMOC Collective, and himself a pianist and composer of considerable gifts, as well as numerous other gifts. And I'm especially delighted to introduce a guest host who I hope will increasingly be part of our life at the Ojai Festival. I should begin by explaining I'm in London at the moment in a hotel room where it's 1:30 in the morning. And I thought all of you, especially Anthony and Matt and Miranda, deserved a much more coherent questioner than I can be. And we're joined by John Schaefer, one of the great heroes of new music life. And John is the host of New Sounds on WNYC, WQXR, New York Public Radio. And New Sounds is one of the places I go to become smarter about new music and what great work is being done in every imaginable corner of the world. John is like a veritable Ojai Festival of the radio, so far-ranging and so discerning in the music he's introduced through his long and wonderful radio career. I'm happy to report that John will be in Ojai. We will share some of the Ojai Talks together, and he'll be kind of a roving guerrilla reporter, capturing sounds and conversations from Ojai for subsequent programs. John, it's just a great, great treat to welcome you to this gathering and many more to come. And I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ara. Really a thrill for me to be stepping into the world of the Ojai Festival, having actually played some of the recordings of last year's festival on New Sounds this year. Of course, last year's music director was John Adams. This year it is the AMOC Collective. And so we can talk a little bit about what AMOC is, why AMOC is, but Anthony, I mean, let's start with your piece, Echoing of Tenses. When you got the commission from Ojai to write this piece, was there a particular brief, or were you just kind of left to your own devices?
Well, first of all, it's so great to be with all of you. And John, thank you so much for hosting. And I just sent off the score about 24 hours ago, I think. So this is all the thrill is still very much rushing in. It's a little bit overload right now, but hasn't quite settled in. I think, yeah, I'm trying to think about the first conversations we had about this piece, which seemed like ages ago, because they were, and it was really due to Miranda Cuckson approaching me and asking if I might be interested in collaborating on a large scale project of some sort with AMOC. At that point, Ojai hadn't yet entered the picture. It was just an idea to think very broadly about what we might want to make together, who might be the other collaborators, but there was really no set theme or fixed anything. So it took about a year from that initial conversation to get to something that resembled any kind of plan for a piece. A number of starts and stops, a number of brainstorming sessions. And in the interim, I had been doing just a lot of reading of poetry, and there were also some conversations with Matt about poets that we admired, some of whom he introduced to me, and some we happened to both already share similar interests with. And increasingly this theme of memory was rearing its head in a way as a kind of through line between all of these poets. And it wasn't that I was necessarily seeking it out, but it just so happened a lot of the poets initially, they were mostly Asian American, and in the end, all 7 of them are. And so naturally, in writing about their personal experiences and cultural experiences, a lot of it had to do with intergenerational experiences, traumas, conversations with relatives, both actual and imagined. And gradually that led to this idea of creating a piece that explored that theme in very different ways through the various texts. And then we settled on an instrumentation and thought that violin, keyboard / piano, I should say, because there's an electronic keyboard that is played simultaneously with the piano, and tenor in the form of the wonderful Paul Appleby would be the instrumentation that we decided on, as well as some pre-recorded sounds, electronics that I've been working on with the composer, the brilliant composer and sound designer for this project, David Bird. So that had all kind of came together around the time that Ojai became a reality, and that in fact that we decided that it would be the perfect place to present the premiere.
Well, and it's also quite nice that it's worked out that we're having this conversation during AAPI month, Asian American Pacific Islander month. Obviously, the premiere will happen in June, but the idea of kind of memory, of intergenerational communication. I mean, reading the texts that you've chosen, and Matt, maybe you can weigh in as well on how the two of you sat down and, you know, how you discussed poems and how, you know, because a great poem is not always open to musical setting. So, you know, it had to be a poem that spoke to the two of you, and then it had to be a poem that you, Anthony, thought you could set. But one of the things that struck me is how often in these poems we get a sense of communication across distance in terms of place, but also distance, as you alluded to, Anthony, in terms of time. So, you know, if the two of you could just kind of talk about that for a moment, how you approach the printed word in this case.
Would you like to take it away, or?
Well, I can start. I mean, look, I've had the most fun job in the world on this piece, a very informal one of just kind of providing material and seeing what sparks Anthony's imagination. It's entirely his piece. But because I do also love poetry and have some history with it and know a lot of living poets, once it became clear that there were these dual focuses of memory and more specifically the Asian American experience, I was able to think, okay, who are the poets who've really explored that terrain? I think we both already loved the work of Ocean Vuong, both his poetry and his fiction. But in college, I got to know the poet Monica Yoon a bit. Arthur Z, I think that's how you say his name, SZE is how it's spelled, is an extraordinarily beautiful lyric poet who was super receptive to the idea and who in fact will be with us at Ojai, reading an original toast as part of my piece, Family Dinner. So, we're really allowing there to be cross pollinations across the festival here. But really, my job was providing grist for the mill, and I'm just happy that some of the poets resonated with you, Anthony.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we had a lot of serendipitous ideas that kind of lined up, the stars aligned in terms of our tastes and what we responded to. And but yeah, I think one thing in terms of John, what you were talking about, distance, in the sense also that among these 7 poets, they represent several generations. The youngest are in their 30s, and Arthur Z is, I believe, 71 or 72. Has been writing poems for 5 decades. In fact, he published his collected works, to be expanded upon, but as of last year, a beautiful volume called The Glass Constellation that is a collection of all of his work. And you can really see the thread throughout all of these beautiful collections. And so the sheer variety of style and voice and experience and background amongst these poets is really something to behold. I think also it's fascinating to see somebody like Arthur, who in a way has explored many of the same themes over the course of his career, has really distilled a very personal style that is very influenced by classical Chinese poetry and nature. He lives in Santa Fe, and he's just been attracted to his surroundings for many, many years. And then on the other side, you have some poets like Kathy Park Hong, who is writing in this almost kind of surrealist, futurist, utopian, I don't know what you would call it, vision of California in who knows what century. So that's about as far removed as one could think from some of the other poets. But yet what unites all of them is this attention to memory and the sparks, the intentional and unintentional, that can arise from often involuntary memory.
A couple of things there I want to follow up on, but before we get too deep into the piece, Miranda, at what point was there a point where you thought, wow, this piece is really turning into something other than what I went to Anthony? I mean, you're a violinist, you probably didn't go to him thinking, hey, let's do a piece that will turn out to be a song cycle. What was your initial thought? I know you and Anthony have collaborated before. What was the idea when you first went to him?
Well, yeah, well, Anthony and I have worked together and have known each other a while, so I've been familiar with his work and have been a great fan. And then in the last few years, we started actually playing and working together on his music. So that certainly was kind of like a spur for me, just being so inspired by that work. But I mean, actually, I specifically thought of him as a member of AMOC. Like I was thinking about projects for this unique collective that we have. And so I actually, from the beginning, I was talking to him about, well, this is what AMOC is. We're interdisciplinary. We have singers, we have dancers, we have this is our instrumentation that we have in the group. So as he said, it was an extremely open-ended idea and invitation. I was like, what do you think? Like, what would you like to do? But I did have it in mind that, yeah, this could be with voice, it could be with text, it could be a lot of things. My only thing was like, I wanted to ask him, and I want to play in it,
Right,
whatever
right.
it is. Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, he could have really come up with anything on any sort of subject or any kind of inspiration he might have had, but his landing on this idea of working with Asian American poets was exciting and meaningful to me, and I'm half Asian myself, and yes, I think something we're all thinking a lot about in terms of, I mean, racial things and just the whole kind of global mashup of cultures
Yeah.
that we have now. So I was excited to work on this.
Well, Miranda, I don't want to assume that everybody listening in knows when you refer to AMOC and as this kind of unique collective, this assemblage. Let's actually tell people what makes AMOC, the American Modern Opera Company, unique. So it's not just musicians.
Yeah. Well, it's conceived. I mean, Matt is a co-founder, so
Co-founder, yep.
he can speak to this for sure. But it's by definition a multidisciplinary group that we're interested in colliding the disciplines and finding the intersections and the way they can meet and blend and be synergistic. So yeah, so we have 4 singers and 3 dancers, whatever the numbers are, a bunch of instrumentalists, and Zach Winokur, a co-founder, is a director as well, and so it's you know, depending on the project, we of course like all delve into our own thing, but we're always looking for these ways that we can meet and combine.
Right.
The whole idea of opera being the combination of these things.
And so Matt, I mean, opera, literally just means work. So, and, from the beginning, operas often included dance, and of course they are settings of text. So that kind of interdisciplinary approach, that's from day one, I'm guessing, when you and Zach formed the ensemble.
Yes, it's true. Opera does mean work. In fact, we briefly toyed with calling the group Labor Party, but that was short-lived for good reason, I think. Yeah, we are an opera company, not in the sense of being a big imposing theater that looks like a courthouse or a Masonic temple with plush seats, but we're an opera company in the sense that we're a group of artists from all the disciplines that compose the art of opera, that constitute the art of opera. And so we're a company that's really focused on the people. And so really what AMOC is these artists. We wanted to gather our favorite collaborators, many of whom worked together already, but we kind of wanted to create a locus and a system of support to help commission and produce new works. And I think, AMOC was founded 5 years ago. And there is, I think, something so beautiful and elegant about Ojai happening around the time of our 5th anniversary, because it is really the dream stage in a way for the company. And a piece like Anthony's, I think, is really a great example of the kind of work that AMOC can support. It's not explicitly staged in this iteration, but I think there is there's a possibility of theatricality, it seems to me, for future iterations of it, and it already brings together a number of disciplines, even just in a concert performance.
Right, of course, Anthony, the written word and music composition coming together in this song cycle, but also a collision of sonic worlds. You referred before to the fact that there are two keyboards, the piano and then an electronic keyboard. And the reason for that is what?
Yeah, so I've long been interested in microtonality and different tuning systems, and it might have just been the fact that I'm a pianist by training, and it was, something that I could never achieve just on a standardized, acoustic piano, and something that I kind of for many years took for granted that was even a possibility. So with the second keyboard, which is placed directly on top of the grand piano, I'm essentially playing both simultaneously. And I have a program that I'm using called Piano Tech, which is modeling different keyboard sounds in real time in a very, there's very high fidelity to the original source, but also there's a great ease of dealing with different tuning systems. So I have something like 5 or 6 different tuning systems that I'm using, often in tandem with the acoustic piano, which creates, as you use the word collisions, a lot of interesting blurring of sonority, which is something that I've never really been a kind of die-hard tuning person. In contemporary music, there some very admirable directions and explorations of tuning, some of which are incredibly precise and fixed. And my approach has always been a little bit more hybrid, a little bit of this combining with a little bit of that. And so I might take, for instance, the piano tuning, which is 12-note equal temperament, and something that is just a little bit off from it, with a few notes that are in what's called just intonation, which deals with natural tuning. And so some of the notes this is particularly true in like the last song in the cycle, which is a setting of Transfigurations by Arthur Z, where you have the two keyboards that are often playing simultaneously the same notes, but a few notes are just a little bit off, and it creates this kind of blurred effect that is somewhat ambiguous and purposely so, I think, to reflect the nature of the words. And then in other cases, the keyboard is playing with very, very fine slices of intervals that, if you play many notes in succession, resemble almost like a sighing effect or a vocalized effect on the keyboard.
So you've prepared a short excerpt. Is this from Golden State?
Yes.
What is the tuning of the second keyboard here? Is this just intonation? Is it quarter tone? What are we dealing with?
Yeah, so the poem is called The Golden State. It's by Kathy Park Hong, which the poet whom I referred to earlier. And it's the keyboard tuning is using a 43 note to an octave system that Harry Partch pioneered. Yep. And so it is in what's known as just intonation. So you have, because of the nature of the 43 tones to the octave, an entire keyboard can really only cover about 2 octaves. But you hear, I try to make it so that in this particular movement, it's creating this floating line above the piano, which is playing rather fixed notes, grounding everything in this kind of repetitive action. And then the melody above it is kind of floating above it, and then it's also being harmonized by the piano kind of switching between the hands. So that's the effect.
All right, let's listen to this. Just a brief excerpt, and it's just the keyboard part from Anthony Cheung's forthcoming piece, Echoing of Tenses. So a couple of things there. First of all, Harry Partch, when he created that 43 note to the octave scale, did so, his stated intention was to reflect the inflections of American English speech, to be able to get the kind of microtonal inflections that Americans use when speaking the English language, as opposed to people in the British Isles who tend to have more of a song-like quality to their speech very often. So that leaves me wondering, Miranda, as a string player, a violinist who doesn't have frets on her instrument, you are not constrained the way Anthony is to the 12-note equal tempered tuning system. So I'm guessing you can get into this sonic world fairly easily, right?
Yeah, it's the microtonal thing is lends itself very well to string instruments because all you're doing is just sliding your finger around and making very small adjustments. So yeah, it's something I've gone into quite a lot in the last decade or so with various composers. As Anthony was saying, some people are very specific about how many cents or
yes,
with all the mathematical measurements of what they're going for, and some are more just a kind of bending of pitches and so on. But anyway, it's something I have a certain amount of experience with, and it definitely it's more natural. I think even on wind instruments, they have to sometimes use different fingerings to get those things. There's a bigger adjustment they have to make physically, but we're really just doing very small physical motions.
Right. And does it approach a kind of speech song quality when you do that?
Yeah, for sure. And there are parts of the piece I find, having looked at it briefly, so but I feel that it's definitely kind of having a speech-like inflection, the line that Anthony's written.
Right.
And kind of it gives a certain kind of emotional inflection to certain moments.
Well, again, Anthony, Matthew, I mean, both of you have experience with setting texts, and of course, that the more florid and musical the setting of the text, the less intelligible the text becomes to the listener. And, we've heard composers like David Lang in recent years take a very kind of simple, spare, almost chant-like approach to setting texts in an effort to increase intelligibility. Harry Partch, with his kind of spoken 43 note to the octave scale, was all about intelligibility. So, Anthony, in this case, what is the vocal line while you and Miranda are dealing with these alternate tuning systems. What kind of, where on that spectrum, and it is a spectrum from speech to song, are the vocals?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. So in this movement that we just heard, Miranda is playing lines that are kind of pushing against, but also sustaining some of the notes that I'm playing on the piano, on the keyboards. And I would say the vocal line is quite direct and also coming out of the resonances of the piano. I really wanted to, intelligibility is a real important part of at least the vocal writing in this piece. I really want it to come across, with a few exceptions. There are movements like A Guide to Usage by Monica Yoon, where the performers are speaking their lines while playing the same in rhythm to the lines, and the notes themselves are very finely tuned in this kind of microtonal way, which gives the effect that the performers are kind of intoning their speech along with the notes. And at a certain point,
so it's not just Paul Appleby whose voice is being used.
No, actually, we get in on it as well. And Paul is for the most part, really, I was really thinking about his traditional lyrical gifts that I knew of from his other work. Although in that movement, we pre-recorded him, so at the end, the layers just get more and more confusing purposely as the text continues to proliferate in a certain way, and through pre-recorded layers of himself and all of us speaking those lines, it just becomes this hum of noise in a way, and that's very intentional. But otherwise, I would say most of the vocal setting in this work is on the spare side, and trying to be as transparent and direct as possible. And often, if the instruments are doing something that is more microtonal, the vocal part is for the most part not. Although in the last movement, I really try to have it match the exact tuning of the keyboards.
Yeah. Matt, is that, as you approach the idea of an American modern opera company, that question of intelligibility, was that something that you wrestled with as an American modern opera composer?
Well, I admire the commitment to intelligibility, but I don't always share it. I love this thing that W.H. Auden, a librettist himself, said about not being sure whether we ever hear words when we hear them sung. We might just hear sung syllables. So I'm generally okay with texts kind of offering themselves up on the pyre of the sacrificial pyre of music. That is kind of what they're for sometimes. But I do think that Anthony's piece is a special case because it is not just a piece of music in which texts are set, but it's also about intelligibility. I mean, I don't want to put words into your mouth, Anthony, but I wonder also if you could talk a bit about this, because it is about different languages and slippages of language and misunderstandings. So in a way, it seems to me that there has to be a standard of intelligibility from which it can sometimes slip.
Yeah, that's kind of built into a lot of the texts themselves. So I was trying to be as aware of the authorial intent as possible, to say, well, is it enough for me to just present it as it is, and the words will kind of take care of themselves with regard to slippage and ambiguity and all those things that the poet is trying to convey? Or do I need to go a little bit further and illustrate some of those ambiguities. And sometimes I don't want it to be too too on the nose or purposeful, but sometimes that's also where the sound design can come in. For instance, in the setting of Ocean Vuong's poem, The Gift, it opens with a very powerful description of teaching his mother how to write letters, A, B, C, A, B, C, and he writes this into the poem. And one way to represent that, of course, is to, you could just have Paul, in this case, speak it, or one of us speak it, or pre-recorded. But what if we were to kind of illustrate that as well with some pre-recorded sounds of scribbles and other things, or in some of the very evocative moments, like in Arthur Z's opening poem called The Network, there's descriptions, very, very refined, beautiful descriptions of water sounds turning into leaves, turning into fire. And it seemed like the perfect opportunity to amplify some of those images through sound design and pre-recorded sound as well.
A lot of these poems seem to be rooted in traditional East Asian form, which makes some of the imagery all the more startling when somebody mentions a car engine or a nail salon, all of these things that kind of pull you out of this sort of pastoral mountains of, provincial China, and then suddenly you're in modern America again. And that occurs numerous times during the texts that you've chosen. How intentional was that?
Very much so. I mean, I think that's reflected in the theme of the piece, the echoing of tenses, where we can feel like we're in some very distant past, and then suddenly be whisked away, to the present or to the future, to very concrete images that we know are from modern life, but then, other images in the poem could very well be from like classical Chinese poems, and I think some of those poets do that incredibly well. And I like that aspect of working with texts that confuse the tenses deliberately. So I think Jenny Xie is a real master of that. There are 3 settings of her work, and I wonder if now might be a good time to maybe read one of her texts to illustrate
exactly.
that. So
you
this
anticipated my next question / request.
This is a poem called Misconjugate. It's from Jenny Xie's upcoming collection called The Rupture Tense, which is a collection all about the confusions of past, present, and future, especially with regard to herself returning to her hometown for the first time in 30 years, meeting her relatives, and feeling the sense of connection and also confusion, a shared cultural connection that is also pulled apart by time over decades. When the distance between subject and verb is longer than a tongue's measurement, I strike myself with the belt of a wrong tense. Where it hits, a band of skin blanches white like a hen. No surprise that I'm more verb than subject. No surprise that time, like an automobile, bleeds down the congealed mountainsides of me. With age, it's harder to make out good deeds which rinse clear after several lathers. All I know is when I'm virtuous, I dare not disturb the wires of the underworld. My present tenses are just basins where endings approach room temperature. That pretty much sums up the whole theme of the cycle right there. And there's a lot of what I try to do in the setting of this poem is to use there's a lot of deliberate ambiguity and confusion between the two keyboards. And there is a kind of like anchor chord of like an E minorish chord in the acoustic piano that then gets pulled apart and with multiple versions of the same chord, but slightly off in the keyboard. And that also affects what is being played in the violin and with the voice. So I'm really trying to aim at a representation of those confusions arising from the text.
The texts also seem to play with form, and I'm wondering, you know, how much that determines the form, literally, of the music that you write. Because as we mentioned before, you and Miranda have worked together before, and maybe in a minute we can hear one of the character studies that she has performed of yours. And it's a piece where there is a kind of audible form, you know, because there's a descending 3-note motif that gets expanded and developed, but it's there throughout the piece. So when you're presented with a pre-existing work of art that has its own form, what does that do to the form of your contribution to the ultimate work?
That's a great question. I think every composer is presented with many possibilities in that sense. You could try to mirror it. You could try to, you know, I think we all try to do justice to it regardless, but you can try to mirror it, or in a sense, you know, make that form audible in the most direct way through certain kinds of circular reoccurrences, or emphasizing cadences, or you know, working with line breaks and jamments, that kind of thing, to create a flow that is in honor of the text. Or you can kind of push against it at moments. You can highlight certain passages and perhaps create an alternate reality of what the composer might have, what the poet might have intended. And maybe Matt, since you work so much with text, do you have your own views on this?
I think they can never be identical. You know, if the I'm not sure that's even physically possible, but if the form of the music really is just trying to imitate the form of the poem, I think it sort of proves itself to be superfluous. So I think there always has to be a slight productive friction. I guess I'm thinking also at the level of the line, that the way that a line moves in poetry is pretty much never the same way that it moves in a good musical setting. And this might be most obvious in composers like, you know, Stravinsky in Rake's Progress, or more recent works, but I think it's equally true, strangely enough, of, you know, super canonical text setters like Verdi, that if you kind of look formally at well, I promise I won't go off on a whole lecture tangent here, but, you know, the opening chorus of a piece like La Traviata, the poetry is in the rhythm of the Mexican hat dance, you know, dell'invito trascorsa già l'ora, but the music is tan tan tiram tararam taridam. It completely goes against it, and for me, that's the job. But every time.
Well, even songwriters who are also poets will tell you that there is a difference between song lyrics and poetry, and that, you know, you cannot simply, you know, convert one to the other. I mean, there are people like, you know, for example, Robin Holcomb, who's a very gifted American composer, been around for many years, writes songs, also writes poems, and always knows which is which when she writes them. But speaking of form, Miranda, I mentioned the character studies that you and Anthony have worked on together, pieces that he wrote. Were these written specifically for you?
No, they were not. But
Okay.
but I recorded them last year, and the album, Anthony's album, is going to be out in a few months, I believe. So.
Okay. In this character study, there is a perceptible form, as I mentioned before. Tell us a little bit about this piece, and tell us where this recording was made.
Well, the piece takes its inspiration from a kind of Sichuan opera where there's a very quick, almost sleight of hand kind of changing of masks by the singer dancer on stage. It's quite remarkable to see. It's almost like you can't believe they did that so quickly, and you didn't see what was, how they actually did that. But so you have these very contrasting switches of character and personality and mood on stage. So in this piece, that's happening. Also, these sudden shifts. Yeah, that's the gist of it. And I believe the first movement was written, and then the second movement was added later. Was written for someone else, but they were combined as one piece. So
Okay,
I don't know
but
which you're going to play. So
I think we're playing the first of them.
okay.
So let's watch. Here's Miranda's performance of one of the character studies by Anthony Cheung. Well, there is an earlier collaboration between Miranda Cuckson and Anthony Cheung, one of the character studies. Of course, we're looking forward to the next one, Echoing of Tenses, next month at Ojai. Miranda, you said you recorded that last year. Is that right?
Yeah, that was last year,
Was that
right?
was that a pandemic, lockdown recording?
Well, I think we were going to do it earlier and it got delayed by the pandemic, right? Um, but yeah, eventually we were able to get in the studio.
Right, but that's
Um,
clearly not a studio.
oh, this one.
Yeah,
Yo, that's just a living room. But
yeah.
oh, this was, yeah. Oh, you mean this being a pandemic, right?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yes. That was actually yeah, that was for a concert I was supposed to do in Miami, and they asked me to make a, a video concert for them of the pieces. So I did that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anthony, Miranda mentioned Sichuan opera. So how often do you go back to your own East Asian roots for inspiration?
Yeah, so in the case of this piece, it was more conceptual than anything. I mean, you don't hear the sounds of Sichuan opera or allusions to the instruments, and sometimes that does occur. I can't help but occur when I write for those instruments, which I have written for traditional Chinese instruments. But it's also not something that um, is like really part of the musical culture that I grew up with. I was born in the U.S. and my exposure to traditional Chinese music certainly came much later and kind of at a remove at first, and I really had to um, you know go in from the perspective of an outsider to learn a lot about the music, and so yeah, I think it's not something that occurs a lot, but I think more recently there have been a number of pieces that have engaged with either poets in the case of this work, or I wrote a piano work, which is a piano concerto, which was an homage to the Japanese American sculptor Ruth Asawa, who I share a great affinity with her work. She also was working primarily in San Francisco, my hometown, for many years, and I just love her wire sculptures. And also the experimental writer Teresa Hakyun Cha, who wrote the incredibly important and experimental work Dictée. I wrote a kind of tribute work to her as well. So I'm drawn to a lot of Asian American artists who often work in kind of abstract mediums, not necessarily engaging on the surface with deliberate representations of Asian culture, although it can't help but inform what they do. Yeah, it's something that I feel very deeply about, and I increasingly, I think, am drawn to this space that comes out of my own upbringing, which is a kind of cultural hybridity or ambiguity between representation of something that at least culturally is very complex, comes from a lot of different places. And yeah, I think this piece that we'll hear at Ojai is a perfect representation of that.
Well, it sounds like the tenor of these poems is right along the lines of what you've just been saying about your own experience of, excavating your the roots of East Asian music in your family, etc. So that must have been quite almost a mirroring experience for you, reading and setting these poems.
Yeah, I think so. I think all of the poets who are in this cycle are active and working and alive, and based in the States, and I think all of them primarily either were born in the States or grew up here. So there is a kind of like second generation or 1.5 generation shared background with them, and we almost a kind of longing for or nostalgia in some cases for things that we know that we share with our relatives or our ancestors, but we don't have necessarily a kind of firsthand experience of. I think this is particularly true in the work of Victoria Chang, who is the other poet who will join us live for a reading as part of this piece. She wrote this beautiful volume last year called Dear Memory, and it's a collection of, I guess they could be considered poems. They're really letters to family members and teachers and friends, and they're kind of her attempt to understand where she's coming from through the past, the lens of memory. And so one of the selection that she'll be reading is a letter to her grandmother. That selection actually is just on its own without any musical accompaniment or background. But I just identified with it so much because she's a little bit older than I am, about a decade older, but the circumstances of our upbringing and the kind of complexities of what it means to grow up Asian in America, and with all of the complexities and difficulties and joys as well, where I just really resonated with in her work. So I'm so glad that she'll be with us as well.
And that'll be on Friday, June 10th, the premiere of Echoing of Tenses. And obviously, we're all looking forward to that. Just really quickly before we wrap up, Matt, Miranda, I mean, AMOC has a lot of stuff on the docket for next month. What are the two of you? Pick something to tell us that we absolutely can't miss.
The cop-out answer is everyone should really come to the whole festival because
Yeah.
it is an immersive, positively Burning Man-esque experience. But let's see. Zach Whitaker and Bobby Jean Smith's new staging of Messiaen's song cycle Arawi, which will be performed by the great duo Julia Bullock and Connor Hannock, is going to be pretty unmissable. That's one among many things that I'm excited about.
I am really delighted that somebody there at AMOC knows and likes the Book of Sounds by the late Hans Otte. Really looking forward to seeing that at Ojai this year as well. Anthony, Matthew, Miranda, thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone else who's been with us this evening. We'll see you in California in June.